I first met Truman at a party George Plimpton gave in the late 1960s. It was a couple of years after In Cold Blood was published. Truman was a man of 5'4", tiny little guy. He came into the room and people just were agape. He was so bigger than life, really.
He grew up in the South, came to New York in his teens, and basically by his early 20s was starting to become known as a short story writer, be published in the early mid-20s, and he became a very kind of high-profile, respectable writer in the New York City, kind of / Europe scene, and because of his personality and his gregariousness with people, and he became quite a beloved personality, and people wanted him to be at events or parties or places just because of the way he was, on top of his talent as a writer. But really what made his name was his talent as a writer, and that's why he was kind of a rare breed at that time of somebody who actually had extraordinary talent as an artist, but also as an extraordinary personality.
I got to know him several years later when I was writing profiles of writers for Esquire and The Atlantic magazine. Truman was the most famous writer in the world after In Cold Blood. He could go anywhere he wanted. We would go to restaurants and he would always get the very best table in the very best restaurants. And I thought, boy, what a lark this is going to be. Lots of great wine, vintage wine, and lunches and dinners, and it'll be over in 2 years, and I'll have a great time doing it. What I didn't know, and what Truman didn't know, was at the time I was starting, Truman was beginning his long downfall. Something that he did in Cold Blood just wrecked his life forever. It was his greatest success, and yet it was his greatest failure in a way. Truman was a wonderful writer, but he was also a fascinating human being. Truman was more fun to be around than anyone else I've ever met, and I've met some famous people. He took a great interest in everything and everybody. When you were talking to Truman, it was as if you were the most important person in the world. And he wasn't putting a show on. He was really fascinated by people. And that's what made his work so great. That's what made In Cold Blood so great, because he was fascinated by people. And he became fascinated by the people in this little tiny town in Kansas.
Well, I came to know so many people there that I wouldn't have known under any other circumstance in my life, and came to like them a great deal, and made many, many friends there. And one of the things that was especially helpful to me was to find that it was possible for me to make really deep and lasting friendships with people who weren't necessarily, that we weren't on the same wavelengths of sensitivity at all, you know? I mean, since I was, I've been, what, in the literary world since I was 17 years old.
Truman became attached to all the people involved in Cold Blood. The detective, Al Dewey, and his wife, Marie, their children, their 2 boys. He had a terrible time at the beginning in Kansas. They were very wary of this odd-looking fellow coming in from New York. But after a few weeks, he won them over. And when he returned to New York, he said, well, at first it was hard, but now I'm practically the mayor of the town. And he was.
Richard Avedon had been in Kansas at the invitation of Capote with his camera and photographed the murderers and the Deweys and the KBI agents and all over Garden City and Holcomb, and went to that Dewey house, went to the Clutter home.
Seeing the chronology of the photographs is really key to understanding, like, it makes it feel so much less precious. Like, it's not a photograph, it's a day in which he followed these guys around and documented them, and all the pictures are good, but some of them are just, you know, you could tell that he didn't know what was going to happen.
He also became very much attached to the two killers, particularly Perry Smith, who had had a bad childhood, just as Truman had had. And Perry's was much worse than Truman's was, but still they had bad childhoods, lonely childhoods. And he could relate to that, and Perry could relate to him. So they had a very interesting relationship, and it was very hard for Truman in the sense that he became attached to Perry, but he also wanted them dead. He wanted them executed so he could finish his book.
The epigraph that he chose for his last book that he never finished was "More tears are shed over answered prayers than unanswered ones." And I think that was true in his life. I mean, that was abundantly true in his life. He wanted nothing but for these guys to die so he could finish his book, and that killed him eventually.
Truman was the most unusual writer possibly in American history, in the sense that he was a character unlike any other. Nobody could have invented Truman. I talked to Truman just a few weeks before he died in 1984, and he said, "There's the one and only TC. There's never been anybody like me, and there ain't gonna be anybody like me again, and God knows that's for sure."